Welcome to episode 5 of the Astro Witch with me, Ellie Remo. Today we're going to be talking about the transits of the week of April 31st, 2023. We're also going to be talking about how I combine my pagan and mystical practices with astrology. And we're going to be diving into a little bit of a Q&A using some questions that I got over on TikTok. If you ever have questions that you'd like me to cover, general astrology questions, not personal ones, be sure to put them in the comments. If there's ever any pop culture or news you would like me to cover, I'm happy to do that as well. First of all, as promised, we're going to talk about the eclipse. The next eclipse will be between May 5th, 6th. The energy can sometimes kind of linger a little before and after that. This will be wrapping up the spring eclipse season. Remember, we have this eclipse season every year. This is nothing new. It is just the cycle of life. This eclipse season will be impacting Taurus and Scorpio the most. It may impact the other fixed signs, Aquarius and Leo, and it may impact everyone on a collective scale as well. One thing about eclipses, they are just a time of chaos and intense change. They are not my special focus, and I think it's due to the sheer chaotic nature that when we talk about an eclipse, no one can really say what's going to happen. There are other transits where we can kind of see and say what's going to happen. During a Mercury retrograde, we know that technology is going to start glitching. When Jupiter comes into Sagittarius, we know there's going to be a lot of financial abundance coming through for a lot of people. And we know that spending money on travel or education or spirituality can be highlighted in those times as well. But the eclipses are truly so chaotic that it's hard to say if the change that comes in is going to be good or bad. Eclipses are by nature malefic and chaotic. But every now and then, they bring in a good, powerful, positive change. Either way, they are bringing in inevitable changes and changes that we all go through every year. We all go through these cycles every year. Looking at the house that Taurus and Scorpio are in for you can show you a little bit more about what this eclipse may bring for you. But at the end of the day, all you can do is ride it out. Eclipses are more cool for kind of looking back and seeing what the energy was like and what happened then. But not always for kind of guessing what things will be in the future because of that sheer chaotic nature. And as someone who uses astrology as divination, perhaps that's another reason eclipses are not at the top of my interest list. If you are a Taurus rising, you may feel this eclipse more around yourself. If you're a Scorpio rising, you may feel it more around your relationships and yourself. If you're a Leo rising, it could be around career, and Aquarius rising could be around home and family. But like I said, all you can do is ride it out. Eclipses are okay. We all need chaos and upheaval in order to change sometimes. On Wednesday, we will have the moon opposing Chiron. I think this could be a good day for healing, especially for those with Aries and Libra placements. If you're needing to do physical healing, mother healing, intuitive healing, fantastic day for that. We have a Venus and Saturn square, so there may be some chaos at some point in this week around your self-care and self-care routines. Frankly, this week is yet another week where there aren't really any new transits. The biggest thing happening is the eclipse. We're getting ready for another Venus transit going into Cancer, joining Mars, and I'm going to talk more about that next week. I'm really excited to talk about that. But for now, things kind of remain the same. Why are eclipses so big? Why is the eclipse the biggest thing happening? Because imagine being in ancient times where you didn't know what an eclipse was. And you look up in the sky, and suddenly the sun is gone. people were freaked out. And so that's why they are chaotic and malefic. And even though we know what's going on now, it still holds that same energy. So I do believe they're still important, just not my area of focus, but still relevant to talk about. It's just that I have recognized that at this point, I've just really been able to see all there is to do is write it out. Right? There's no sense of force. There's no sense of even trying to predict. What will be, will be. So that's really all I have to say around the transits this week. Let's dive into some of the other mystical topics of the week. First of all, I want to talk about how I combine my paganism and astrology, my witchy, mystic side, and the practice of astrology. So for me, the two combine very perfectly. I am a Hellenic pagan, meaning I worship and work with the Greek deities. And the form of astrology that I practice partially comes from Greece. Hellenistic astrology comes from other places, Babylonia, Egypt, and I'm even starting to study some of the medieval traditions in Europe. But a big part of the practice that I do comes from Greece. And the gods that I've always felt guided to, always worshipped, also come from Greece. So that in itself makes me feel very connected, because the form of astrology that I practice would have been practiced around the time that my gods were originally being worshipped, and that does feel very special to me. So some of the ways that I connect to this is by using the Greek names of the planets. I don't do this when I'm talking like here or on TikTok for easeability, right? If I start calling Venus the star of Aphrodite, people will be like, oh, what's that? What's that new thing that was discovered? But in my personal practice, that's something that I do. It makes me feel very connected to my gods. I also work with specific gods around specific transits. Like if there's a really cool Venus transit, I'm going to be working more with Aphrodite. Right now, I've been trying to connect a little more with Aries during my Mars return. So that's also one way that I connect those two sides of my spirituality, is it can help me figure out which gods might need my attention based on how it's interacting with my personal transits. And I also believe we can sometimes see by looking at our astrology chart which deities are going to be connected to us the most. I'm sure that's not always the case, and there are many deities I'm connected to that don't really show up in my chart, but I do like to look at the 3rd house and the 9th house to see maybe important deities. And in my 9th house, I have the star of Aphrodite and the star of Hermes. Those are my two main gods. I also have the sun, and I don't work with any sun gods, but that's okay. In my 3rd house, I have the star of Zeus, and I don't work with Zeus, but I do honor, worship, revere Zeus. And also the asteroid Hermes is also in my 9th house, so just a few interesting things. I also think asteroids or planets in your 1st house can be very telling for potential energies and deities you may be able to connect with more easily. And many Greek deities do have at least an asteroid named after them. Now, the other thing is you can absolutely, like, the stars have been named after deities from different cultures. That's always been the thing. Every culture that begins to practice astrology begins to name them after their own gods. So you can always start to assign these gods the names of the gods that you worship with, and that's totally fine. Sorry, assign the stars the names of the gods. That's not disrespectful. While when I'm looking at gods, I don't equate Venus and Aphrodite. I see them as two different goddesses and would respect and revere them in two different ways. Of course, with some kinds of connections because of how the Roman and Greek people connected, but I still like to see them as two different entities. But when it comes to the planet Venus, at one point Venus was named after Aphrodite. So it's a little different than just equating all of the gods as being kind of one and the same. I'm also currently planning, and I've started a little bit, on studying the mythology behind the zodiac signs to help with magic. And I do think that understanding the gods that the different signs and stars and planets were named after also helps you understand it. And we shouldn't rely solely on that, right? But it can give us some understanding because they were named after them for a reason. I think less so for the outer planets. They were just kind of named like, hey, let's keep up the pattern, but definitely for the traditional planets up to Saturn. I also love to use transits to help me with magic. Everyone does this. Everyone who does magic, even people who quote unquote manifest rather than doing magic, everyone does this. Because in the simplest form, this is working with the moons. This is releasing on the full moon, setting intention on the new moon, blah, blah, blah. But the only difference is I do a little bit more than that. I also look into specific Venus transits for when I'm going to do big transformations in my physical appearance. I'll look for specific Jupiter, Mercury transits for money making. I'll look for transits through my 10th house before I do a career or attention grabbing type of work. My wife and I will do love magic together during certain love transits or transits through our 7th house. So that's the other thing, is I kind of connect it to my magic in that way. Another thing is doing glamour astro magic. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. I've been talking about it a lot on TikTok. But basically, I think a great way to activate different planets in your chart is by presenting as them, is by dressing up as them. And that's been proven several times in my life. So that's one way that I love working with it, glamour astro magic. And I did talk about in my book, Love and Glamour, as well. I also, like I said, I like to use the transits to connect with the gods during certain transits. I find it easier to connect with certain gods. Just like during certain times of the year, you might worship a certain god more, connect with a certain god more. I feel like it can be the same with transits. Astrology, one other thing that I love that astrology can do spiritually is teaching us how to utilize our intuition. And by looking at a few different placements, you can really learn which forms of intuition are going to be strongest for you. Namely, the 3rd house, the 9th house, and the moon. So what does that mean? If you have, say, 3rd house, 9th house, moon in a fire sign, then you might relate really deeply to candle magic in the way that I do, or like fire scrying in the way that I do. If you have it in a water sign, you might relate to kind of moon gazing. You might relate to lunar energy, especially if it's in Cancer. You might relate to water scrying. You might relate to like mermaid witchcraft, sea witchcraft. If you have it in an air sign, you might be really amazing at manifesting with your words, writing with your words, right? And kind of actual written out spells, even spells that are kind of rhymey, that might be totally your thing. If you have it in an earth sign, you may love crystal magic, or you may love connecting with the earth and connecting with earth deities. So I have actually for an example, I have my moon in the 8th house in Pisces. And so water is something that really deeply connects me intuitively. I always love going into the ocean and kind of have always felt really spiritually connected by doing that. And the moon definitely impacts my intuition as well. There are certain lunar phases where I can do more intuitive work. I can do more readings. I can connect more in that way. And then there are certain lunar phases where I kind of have to slow down. And my 3rd house and the 9th house as well. First of all, the fact that they are packed, like most of my placements are in my 3rd and 9th house. And I also happen to have a spiritual practice as my life purpose. But I do have lots of fire placements over in that 9th house. 3 fire placements in the 9th house, and that definitely shows my love of candle magic. And even, I love incense burning. It's always been my favorite way to cleanse, my favorite way to give offerings. And that kind of connects the air of Libra, which is my 3rd house, with the fire of Aries, which is my 9th house. So if you're wanting to learn how to work with your intuition and your magic best, I would say study those and study the planets that are in those, because they can tell you the energies that you work with. Like, I have Venus in my 9th house and I love magic. I have Mercury in my 9th house and I do love speaking my magic into being. Like, I love spells that I literally physically speak out loud. I have Jupiter in the 3rd house, and yes, I love abundance magic. I love working with Jupiter energy. And I love doing workings on Jupiter days too. The next topic we're going to be talking about is how to constructively work with Mercury retrograde. Mercury retrograde is not an evil, villainous time. It is a time of pausing and reconsidering where you are. So if we look at this as a metaphor of a writer, if you're a writer, this is the time to spend time editing and perfecting rather than to be writing. And if you're an actual writer, that is your sign that it's okay to take a break from the push and the hustle of needing to write and to instead kind of pause and look at what you've already written. This is a great time to be doing some editing work. And it's also a great time to plan for the future. It's a great time to plot rather than write. So here are a few things you can do. One is you can look over the last 2 weeks. What frustrations or mess ups or blocks have you experienced? The 2 weeks before the retrograde is a foreshadowing period of the retrograde. So taking that time to pause and work through it, and then you could even potentially do some spells to clear, release, transmute that energy, what have you. The other thing you can do is plan for the future. Where do you want to be, say, a month from now? Because once the eclipse is over, I usually find that I start zooming on through whatever blocks there were. So figure out, okay, that's where I was, that's where the frustration was, and where do I want to go next? So those are the ways I recommend using Mercury retrograde constructively. Also, if there is anything from the past that you've been wanting to wrap up, like a conversation you've been wanting to have, even though it feels very past based and you're like, oh my god, am I moving backwards? It's bad. Just do it. Don't judge yourself. Don't judge that urge. Reach out to that person. It's gonna happen sometimes. Everyone's like, don't text your ex because it's Mercury retrograde. I'm like, do text your ex because it's Mercury retrograde. And that doesn't mean you're going to get together, but what if that's the like wrap up that you need? What if you get to have a conversation that makes you feel like you're finally ready to let go of them? So sometimes Mercury retrograde means people show up for you. Sometimes it means you have to show up with them. And either way, it can be an amazing and cathartic experience if you work with it. And lastly, or maybe this isn't lastly, I think it kind of, yeah, lastly, we're going to be talking about spells during the eclipse. A lot of the blanket advice is don't do spell work during the eclipse. Myself personally, I don't do spell work during the eclipse, but that's just because it's not my thing. I don't think everyone has to stop and not do spell work. I do think it's good to acknowledge there's some chaotic energy, but chaotic energy is not always bad. So one thing is, if you are a baneful witch, which I am not, so I'm speaking to baneful witches who are well practiced, confident, and can do so safely. If you are a baneful witch, this is a great time for baneful workings. Like, it is a great time to rock someone's shit if you feel really confident in your ability to do so. The reason I think confidence is important is because would that Mercury retrograde maybe send it back to you? Would that eclipse energy be a little chaotic? Yes. But if you are confident and you know that this is about justice and your guide team is backing you and, you know, you dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, I think this is an amazing time because eclipse energy is inherently chaotic and malefic. So why not make use of it if you do that kind of working? If you don't have anything to do around that right now, you can collect eclipse water for future practices. Not only baneful, any practice, any spell that requires chaos. That's what this time is about. Is there a big major change you have been needing to make in your life? Something that you're like, I know this would be so good for me. I know this needs to happen. And you just need to like kind of put some chaotic. It's like when people used to get not malachite. What's the green crystal everyone on TikTok loves? Starts with an M. You know what I'm talking about. Like, there's that crystal that's rocking everyone's shit, and some people love it and some people hate it. And that's like the energy of an eclipse, pretty much. Like, you're choosing to rock your own shit if you do spell work around changing your life. But sometimes we need that push. If you want to do a self-induced tower moment, this is the time. If you're like, my life is not making me happy, I need a full upheaval 180, use this eclipse energy. What big major changes do you want to make? But don't be surprised when there's chaos behind it. Any spell work where you require or don't mind a little mess and chaos, now's the time to do it. Anything that requires perfection and that you have this really set idea on how it's going to be, save that for a later date. That is my general recommendation here. I personally won't be doing any big workings. For me, it's been about like small things, divination, kind of refreshing my wards, things like that. And it's been fine and dandy. But it's ultimately up to you. Play safe. And that's going to wrap up this week's episode of the Astro Witch. Thank you all for your amazing questions. If you have any more questions for me, please put them down in the comments.